Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the story of a freelance journalist who's seeking records related to the beat he covers, UFOs. Journalist Dan Otis is a freelance reporter who does work for CTV and Vice News and covers the topic of unidentified flying objects, which is something that's had a long-standing public fascination. In recent years, news coverage of UFOs has exploded, given video footage from the United States, as well as US government congressional hearings on the topic. UFOs have become an increasingly serious topic. Now, to cover this story in Canada, Otis has obtained documents from the Canadian military, the RCMP, and NORAD. These documents are always partially redacted, but tend to provide enough information for him to do his reporting. After receiving a tip related to possible UFOs near nuclear plants in Ontario, Otis requested all records related to UFOs at or near Ontario power generation nuclear facilities between 1999 and present. After getting Otis's request, OPG went nuclear. Yes, pun intended. They flat out refused to provide him with anything, which Otis alleges is contrary to their obligations under the Freedom of Information and Privacy Protection Act. Now, we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which is the charity I work for, agree with Otis, and we're helping him with his fight. Here today to talk about this legal battle is Dan Otis, and we'll be later joined by CCF lawyer Josh DeHaas. Dan, thanks so much for joining us today. This is a really fascinating topic. It's something I've been fascinated with since I was a kid. Now, I know that UFOs is something that, to be honest, some people will scoff at, but it's something that really, as I tried to say in the opening, has become an increasingly serious topic with these congressional hearings in the US and increased international coverage. So what can you tell me about what exactly has changed with UFOs and reporting, and why this is an issue Canadians should really be paying attention to?
Well, anybody who's been paying attention to the stories see that there's been a lot of news about UFOs coming out of the United States. There they call it UAP, or Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon. Let's just stick with UFOs. But there's been revelations in US media that the Pentagon has had UFO offices to investigate anomalous sightings. And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence of the United States started releasing annual reports on the subject starting, I believe it was in 2021 of June. NASA has put out studies. NASA's put out a study. There's been multiple congressional hearings on the subject, hearing from military people, current and former. And what it's showing is that, credible observers like military personnel, pilots, police officers, etc., are reporting things that they can't easily identify. And the United States is taking it as a potential national security threat. And, NASA is looking at it as a scientific question. So all of these developments are showing that, people are seeing unusual things and that it's worthy of further investigation.
Now, you've been covering this story for a while now. What type of things has your reporting uncovered?
Sure. I've been able to uncover documents that show Canadian military officials have met with their U.S. counterparts on the subject. There was a presentation that was given to our former defense minister on the subject of UFOs. I was able to get the PowerPoint presentation for that. Another thing my reporting has revealed is that the Office of the Chief Scientific Advisor of Canada, basically the Prime Minister's top scientific advisor, their office has launched what's called the Sky Canada Project that aims to release a public report on Canadian UFO procedures as well as recommendations. And that's supposed to come out this year.
Wow. Um, we've got about 30 seconds. Is there anything you can tell us about how common an occurrence it is in Canada to have sightings like this that are of interest?
Yeah, sure. My research shows that pilots on airlines like Air Canada, WestJet, Porter, etc., there's about a dozen or so reports like that coming every year. And then there's a degree of historical continuity. We see reports like this happening year after year after year going back to the early 1950s in the
Wow.
Canadian record. So
Well,
people seeing unusual objects and lights and things moving in ways that they can't explain.
fascinating. Now, we've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to talk about the introduction to this fight you're having with OPG. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a legal challenge to a government agency that's been denying journalist Dan Otis access to documents related to UFOs, which is the story that he covers as a journalist. Now, Dan, part of the way you conduct your investigations as an investigative journalist is through filing freedom of information requests. And we have legislation in Canada that governs what type of public documents public can get access to and how. Now, how many freedom of information requests have you been filing? Where exactly are you submitting them? And what kinds of things have you learned as a result of these FOIs? Now, I know you said that we got a PowerPoint presentation to from I think you said in the military, but what else? Where? How many are you submitting? Where are you submitting them? And what kind of stuff are you finding?
Yeah, well, I submit freedom of information requests on various subjects in my work, but in terms of UFO stuff, we're at over 200 now over the past 3 years. Predominantly federal requests to the Departments of National Defense, and as particularly the Air Force and Canadian NORAD operations. I have requests filed with the RCMP, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, the PCO, the Privy Council Office, the Canadian Space Agency. The list goes on. So far, I've received thousands of pages of material that show, UFO-related briefings, cases, case files, and procedural documents, particularly from Transport Canada and the Air Force and NORAD. And those, for example, I've obtained Air Force logbooks that show in real time how air traffic controllers are radioing NORAD officials to help, identify things that pilots are seeing. And there are procedures on the books. If you get a UFO call, do X, Y, Z. My reporting is we've published all that procedural material.
Now, you filed FOIs related to nuclear facilities. What piqued your interest in nuclear facilities in particular? I know that you filed FOIs in New Brunswick related to their nuclear facilities and in Ontario, and you got very different responses. So first, why the interest in nuclear, and then what has the response to those FOIs been?
Yeah, I mentioned that a lot of the news has been driven by the US, and there are some journalists have made an anecdotal connection between nuclear facilities and UFO sightings, particularly power plants, as well as, nuclear missile silos and things like that. In addition to that, I received a tip from someone, one of my readers, who said that they had a relative that works at the Pickering nuclear plant near Toronto, and that they were regularly seeing things that they couldn't easily identify. So there are 4 active nuclear power plants in Canada. 2 are operated by OPG, Ontario Power Generation. They're near Toronto. There's another one up close to the Bruce Peninsula, which is privately operated, which means we can't access it through freedom of information. And then there's another one in New Brunswick. So I filed almost identical reports to both Ontario Power Generation, OPG, and New Brunswick Power. Both requests were initially denied on security grounds. I appealed both, and New Brunswick Power eventually, did what they are supposed to do, and they released records that were redacted, to protect relevant safety and security information. OPG, on the other hand, denied records, and as you said, they've kind of gone nuclear in this fight to withhold this material.
Look, I assume as an investigative reporter, for someone like you, a flat out refusal of no, we won't give you anything. It's sort of like catnip. I mean, it's just so irresistible to know why they are refusing. So, what's your reaction been like to that refusal?
Well, I got the refusal, and my first question right back was, "Well, were records identified?" And as soon as they said yes, I filed my complaint right away. I mean, to be told that records exist and no, you can't have them seemed ridiculous to me. I mean, NORAD and our Air Force are releasing redacted
Mhm.
records, and they have a very clear safety and security
Yeah, so
nexus.
so
Uh,
what did they give you a reason? Did they say it was safety and security? And why would they have that issue but NORAD and the military wouldn't?
E- Exactly. They said that they had the power to withhold all of this material for safety and security reasons. That was their initial justification. And after I filed the complaints, they came up with 11 more reasons
Hmm.
why they wanted to withhold the material. And then they also filed a constitutional question
Wow.
essentially saying that their obligations under federal
Right.
nuclear security laws
W-
would
Right.
make them unable
We,
to fulfill
we've
the provincial freedom of information laws.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing UFO reporting by investigative journalist Dan Otis and the refusal of Ontario Power Generation to disclose information related to UFOs near nuclear sites. Now, we're now joined by lawyer Josh DeHaas with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the same charity I work for, and we're assisting Mr. Otis with his fight to obtain these records. Now, Josh, thanks for joining us. First, how did you and Dan get connected on this issue?
Well, as you know, Christine, I used to work in journalism, and so I had the opportunity to work with Dan in the past. And he knew that the Canadian Constitution Foundation is very interested in defending freedom of expression, and of expression is certainly at issue in this particular case because you can't do journalism if you can't have access to the documents that you need. And so Dan reached out to us, and we had some time to assist, and we were happy to help.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, Josh, because I think at its core, this case is really about freedom of the press. What can you tell me about this principle and how it's at stake in a fight like this one over access to records?
Sure. So freedom of the press is very closely related to freedom of expression, and it's a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that the powers that be, whether you're talking about the King of England or the federal government, they cannot withhold information. They can't censor people who want to print their ideas, and it has a long history in our Constitution. It goes all the way back to the early days of the printing press arriving in the UK. It was about 10 years after the printing press arrived that the king created a new court, the Court of Star Chamber, that was specifically tasked with punishing people who tried to print things that didn't have the king's approval. And there was one famous case of a man named John Lilburn, and he was a leveler, which is was a radical political group back then. They had such crazy ideas like, more people should be allowed to vote, not just the very wealthy, or that there should be some separation between church and state. And he was sentenced by this Court of Star Chamber. And on the day that he was to be pilloried, instead of apologizing, he had more pamphlets distributed. And this is sort of the starting point of freedom of expression in some ways and freedom of the press. Fast forward to 20th century Canada, and the first big civil liberties case here was the Alberta Press case, and that case was a question over whether Alberta's act that said that they could censor any newspaper article and demand printing of whatever response the government wanted, whether that was constitutional or not. The Supreme Court said, no, you have freedom of the press. And so that became established in our law. And of course, in 1982, it was outlined specifically in our charter. It says not just freedom of expression, but also freedom of the press. And in an access to information case like this, the question is, if you can't access documents to know what's going on, how can you print the stories that you need to print? And so in this particular case, we didn't actually even have to make a charter argument because the statute itself is clear that you have a general right of access to information and that exceptions to that need to be specific.
That's beautifully said, Josh. And I think it's fascinating that Dan's case about this reporting on UFOs fits into this long legacy of cases about freedom of expression and the role that journalists and the media plays in upholding democracy. Dan, is there anything you want to say about that value and how you view the role of journalists within the democratic system?
I mean, journalism and free press is a cornerstone of democracy. How can you hold your leaders to account who are, elected officials employed by us? How can you hold them to account without information on them? And I think the UFO topic in particular really speaks to this just because of the long history of denials and obfuscation from governments. You look back in the declassified records, and this is something that was literally on the radar for defense officials in Canada and the US going back to the dawn of the Cold War. But it only seems that recently that we're actually starting to see some cracks in the facade and getting some information from our governments on the subject.
I mean, this is serious stuff, right? I mean, we had the incident last year of that Chinese spy balloon that ended up in the United States, and it had entered the United States by going through Canadian airspace. I mean, this ultimately was it ultimately was identified, but it began sort of as a UFO. So I think it's really important that the government know about these things, about what these objects are, and that they're monitoring them and tracking them. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a Ontario government agency refusing to disclose records related to UFOs near nuclear sites to a freelance investigative journalist. Now, Josh, OPG, Ontario Power Generation, has flat out said that it will not give this information to Dan. They initially have claimed this on the basis of national security. Um, they've subsequently added, I think, 11 more grounds, Dan has said. Why do you think that a flat out refusal to disclose is just taking things too far under the statute?
Well, the statute is quite clear in its purpose section right at the front that you have a right to access information, and that any exceptions to that right are to be limited and specific. And those exceptions need to be uh, things that are under the Act in sections 12 to 22, and they are things like danger to the health and safety of an individual, or prejudice to the national security, or potentially, leaking a trade secret. Those are very specific things. And, obviously, OPG has an interest in protecting public safety and national security, but, Dan has not been seeking any records that would disclose those things that would put anybody actually at risk. What he's seeking is the information that he's entitled to under the Act. And the Act also has a section that makes clear that where information can be redacted to comply with those limited and specific exemptions, then OPG is required to redact those portions and to produce the rest of the record. But unlike New Brunswick Power, which did produce records that were redacted, OPG is just flat out refused. It's thrown basically everything at Mr. Otis and said, we can't tell you even how many documents there are, how many incident reports there are, and we're just going to give you nothing whatsoever. And that is just not how the law is supposed to work.
Now, Josh, what are the next steps here? I know that you've put together with Dan a appeal of the refusal to disclose that goes to, I think, the privacy commissioner. So what's the next steps with that, and then where does it go?
Yeah, so they got their, they used their taxpayer funded fancy lawyer to write a big, long, complex federalism argument and make some other arguments towards us. We responded with our own arguments, which we think are clearly much better. At this stage, what's happening is they are entitled to a reply, so they can give a short reply to our submissions. We'll get a chance to reply, and then the Information and Privacy Commissioner will make a decision about whether the records need to be produced, or at minimum, whether OPG needs to go back to the drawing board here and take a closer look at what they really ought to be producing.
Now, Dan, This is all a not easy process, and you've done this over 200 times with all these FOIs. And I know I've spoken to a lot of journalists who have made complaints over the years about Canada's freedom of information system, how the system just really is slow, it's overly secretive. It can sometimes take years to get documents. What can you tell me in about a minute about that flawed FOI, freedom of information system?
Well, yeah, that's my experience. It can be glacial in speed. I've had requests come back years after being filed with, one or two pages that are barely relevant to the question at hand. There's a lot of subjectivity in terms of what gets disclosed and what gets redacted, because a lot of the redactions are made, the redactions initially are made internally by access to information teams within Defense or Transport Canada, for
Mhm.
example. I find I'm routinely challenging redactions and winning because they're just redacting too much. The speed, I think, on average, they're supposed to legally be able to reply within 30 days and have some extensions. I think the average for me is about 200 days
Wow,
to get documents, but
that's
I've had
outrageous.
some into 3
Yeah,
years. I have some
that's
that I filed years ago that are still open.
all the time we have. Thank you both so much. Good luck with your case, Dan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your help.
We've heard today about the fight to obtain information about UFO sightings near nuclear sites. This is a matter of increasing public interest in serious news coverage, and the laws of access to information apply to these government agencies. We're proud to support the work of journalists fighting to do their jobs and the right to a free press. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.